I felt the heat of his breath on my skin as his fingers lightly traced the inside of my thigh. It happened so fast that I barely had time to react, or maybe I didn't want to. He was 72, I was 23, he was my stepfather, a man I was supposed to see. His family, yet every time we were alone my heart pounded in a way it never should have. His touch lingered just long enough to pass as an accident, but we both knew the truth. There were no accidents between us. It had been building for months. Longer glances that held too much weight, fleeting touches that stayed for a heartbeat longer than necessary, conversations that felt just a little too intimate. But tonight something shifted. He leaned in closer, his lids just inches from my ear. I should have pulled away. I should have said something. Anything. Instead, I held my breath. That night started like any other. My mother was out at one of her social events, charity galas, dinner parties, all the things she did to maintain the perfect image of our family. The house was quiet, just the two of us. I had come downstairs in nothing but a silk robe, not thinking much of it, or maybe I wanted to see if he would notice, and he did. He was sitting in the dimly lit living room, a glass of whiskey in his hand, watching the fire flicker in the fireplace. His shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, his sleeves rolled up just enough to reveal strong-veined forearms. I had never thought of him like this before, had I? I walked past him, my bare legs brushing against the edge of the coffee table. His gaze followed me. I felt it. It burned into me, sent a shiver down my spine. He spoke in a measured, smooth voice, and I leaned against the doorway to ask why he hadn't answered. His eyes narrowed slightly, and I worried he wouldn't answer at all. Instead, he sipped slowly from his drink, put the glass down, and rested his forearms on his knees, as complications are inevitable. He wasn't acting foolish or pretending. He was actually realizing it, and my heart missed a beat. "Do you want me to go put something else on?" The corner of his mouth twitched, but he didn't smile. Would it make a difference? The tension between us crackled like the fire beside him. I should have escaped the room, but instead I walked closer, our eyes locked. He remained motionless as he watched. As we stood there, I remained motionless for what seemed like an eternity, until his fingers gently caressed my wrist. The pressure was intense, but I resisted the urge to withdraw. My breath caught as his hand slid down my arm, resting just above my knee. At that moment, my stomach knotted, and I suddenly realized that I should have spoken up or stopped this before it started. The problem was that I wanted to see how far he could push me, so I let him. As he raised his thumb to draw gentle, rising circles across my flesh, I let him to continue. I felt his low, murmuring voice urging me to stop, but I couldn't bring myself to speak. I swallowed hard, my heart racing with anguish. His silence lingered for what seemed like an eternity, and I let out a long breath, realizing that I had been holding my breath the whole time. He casually picked up his whiskey, as if nothing had transpired. "Go to bed, sweetie," he said. The next morning, I awoke as if in a parallel universe. The air was thick with a different atmosphere. Even though I wanted to tell myself that everything was in my imagination and that nothing had changed, I knew deep down that something had changed and that there was no turning back. I made my way downstairs, keeping my steps light, not sure what to expect. When I entered the dining room, he was already there, sitting at the table reading the newspaper as if nothing had happened. My mother was across from him, stirring her coffee, scrolling through her phone, lost in whatever morning routine she had. The scene was normal, perfectly staged, like nothing was out of place. But the second I stepped closer, I felt it. His presence was suffocating. Even when he didn't look up, I forced myself to sit, pretending I didn't notice the way my hands trembled slightly as I reached for my cup. "Do you have any plans today?" My mother's voice was casual, but I flinched slightly at the suddenness of it. "I might meet up with Claire," I said, keeping my voice neutral, steady. She nodded, sipping her tea. "I won't be home tonight. Charity event, might go late." I swallowed, forcing myself to nod. The idea of being alone in the house with him again made my stomach twist into something unrecognizable. I wasn't sure if it was fear or anticipation, and that terrified me more than anything else. He still hadn't said a word, still hadn't looked up, but I could feel his attention on me like a weight pressing against my skin. I wasn't imagining it. Breakfast continued, and I forced myself to act normal, to go through the motions, even though every nerve in my body was hyper-aware of him. As soon as I was done, I pushed my chair back, needing to escape. By the time I was outside, I could finally breathe. The tension eased slightly, but not enough to make me forget what had happened. Feeling the need to escape, I hopped in my car and headed out. Claire and I met in our normal cafe, but I was so preoccupied with my own thoughts that I hardly paid attention when she was spilling the beans about her recent drama. I would nod and smile when appropriate, but deep down, I knew she was accusing me of not listening. I tried to shrug it off, but she didn't understand. She looked at me thoughtfully before shaking her head. Whatever it is, I hope she would understand that it's worth it. I wasted the remainder of the day pretending to shop while aimlessly scrolling through my phone in the mall, but no matter what I did, I couldn't stop checking for a message from him. By the time I got home, the sky had already turned black. I waited in my mother's car for what felt like an eternity, clutching the wheel tightly, trying to calm my racing heart. When I finally stepped foot inside, the house was dead silent. I stepped gingerly, my footsteps slender on the hardwood floor, as if I were trying not to wake something that had already started. I convinced myself that he was either upstairs or in his office, far away from me. But as I passed the living room, I spotted him sitting in his chair, glass in hand, staring at the fire, exactly where I had left him the night before. In the dim light, his shirt was unbuttoned at the collar and sleeves were rolled up. He appeared deep in thought, but the moment his eyes met mine, I knew better. I should have continued walking or gone straight to my room, but I didn't budge for even a second. Then he put down his glass and said, "Come here." My body responded before my mind could absorb the information, and I walked forward slowly, hesitantly, but unrelentingly. He watched me closely, his expression unreadable, but there was something in his eyes that made me feel a rush of excitement. As I drew near to him, I could feel the warmth of the fire behind me and smell the whiskey on his breath. He reached out and lightly touched my wrist, testing it. I should have said something or pulled away, but I didn't. His touch sent a shiver down my spine, and he whispered, "You shouldn't be here." My words never left my mouth, but I wanted to say low, "And you shouldn't either." His fingers gently curved around my wrist as his thumb dragged a slow, purposeful pattern on my skin. I felt my heart race and my breath catch, but I remained motionless. With a tiny tightening of his grip, my system was shocked once again. With a subtle tilt of my chin, his other hand reached up and touched my jaw, causing my heart to pound against my ribs as I gasped for air. I should have stopped him sooner, but I was curious to see how far he could push me before he finally let go. He let out a loud breath and then leaned back, picking up his glass again as if nothing had transpired. Now it was time for bed, my love. As I turned to depart, the sensation of his touch clung to my skin, reminding me that this was merely the start. We had mastered the art of concealing it. In front of my mother, we were flawless. He played his part without flaw, never letting our vulnerabilities show. But when we were alone, there was an electric charge between us, something neither of us dared to name. So, I was filled with a strange mix of excitement and fear. My mother suggested a weekend getaway to our country house. On the one hand, I told myself it was just a regular getaway, surrounded by too many people for anything dangerous to happen. On the other hand, I knew better. The idea of spending 2 days in the same house, sharing quiet mornings and long evenings, felt like the drive up was uneventful. My mother chatting away about the upcoming renovations she wanted to make to the house. I sat in the back seat pretending to listen, but all I could focus on was him. He was driving, his hands gripping the wheel firmly, his jaw tense as if he was just as aware of the situation as I was. Every now and then I saw his eyes flicker to the rearview mirror, and each time our gazes met, my stomach twisted into knots. When we arrived, everything felt too quiet. The house was massive, surrounded by endless trees and open land. No nosy neighbors, no distractions, just us. My mother was in her element, immediately making plans for the weekend, suggesting a big family dinner that night, a golf game the next day. I nodded along, pretending I was interested, but my mind was elsewhere. Dinner that night was almost unbearable. We sat around a large wooden table, candles flickering between us, my mother happily recounting some old story from years ago. I tried to focus on my plate, on the conversation, on anything but him, but I felt his eyes on me, watching, burning. I was so ignorant to the fact that my fork shook ever so little in my hands, and that I almost knocked over my glass as I reached for it. My mother made fun of my clumsiness and chuckled. The true cause of my trembling hands after the house was silent that night. I hurried out onto the terrace in search of fresh air. The night was chilly, the sky was clear, and the stars were dazzling. I embraced myself, trying to calm my breathing and clear my head. As soon as I turned back, I heard the door open behind me. He was standing outside, only a few steps away. His presence was immediately apparent. We stood there, air shifting between us and quiet stretched between us, dense with everything unsaid. As he drew nearer, I could feel my heartbeat quicken. Even though I didn't pull away, Quicken's fingers briefly touched my wrist, sending a chill down my spine. He remained silent, and I peered up at him, expecting an explanation, an excuse, or anything else. All he did was stare back at me. His expressionless, black eyes. I should have stepped away sooner. I should have ended this before it began, but I refrained because I didn't want to. Things were getting out of hand. At first, it had been subtle, just longing looks and awkward silences, but now my mother was noticing that I wasn't stupid and was asking questions that made my chest tighten every time, like, why am I staying home so much? Why am I not going on dates anymore? Why have I suddenly lost interest in things I used to love? I would shrugged off her questions. In her eyes, I could see that she wasn't convinced, and we sat through an intolerable dinner that night. Sitting in a peaceful restaurant with my partner, I couldn't help but feel her watch as I raised my glass to my lips. At first, I brushed it off as my imagination, but then I observed how her eyes moved to him, as if she were carefully scrutinizing our every move. I ate slowly, pretended to listen to her, and tried not to freak out. But the tension was so thick that I couldn't tell if I was succeeding or failing at everything I was doing. As we were making our way back to the house, she said, "You have to leave for a business trip tomorrow." "Just 2 days." I nodded, trying to keep my voice even and my stomach twisted. I told myself that those 2 days alone wouldn't mean anything, that nothing had to happen, but I knew better. The house felt different the following evening. The silence stretched out in a way that made my chest feel like a titan. I had spent the day convincing myself to stay away from doing anything. It was reckless not to make a choice I would later regret, but as soon as her car drove away down the driveway, I knew it was time to leave. The drive was quiet, but my mind was racing with thoughts of why I shouldn't have gone there or done this. Despite my fears, I didn't turn around. The hotel was discreet, the type of place where no one asked questions. I walked through the doors, my heart racing and my hands cold. I told myself to stop because I still had time to change my mind, but my feet carried me forward. I eventually reached his door and knocked. He opened it almost instantly, as if he had been waiting. We locked eyes, and we sat down by the window, overlooking the city lights. At first, we didn't speak. The silence was thick and stretched too tight, but neither of us appeared to be, and I didn't respond because I didn't realize we had spoken, but I hardly recalled a word. In the midst of our conversations, there were periods of silence and exchanges of expressions that conveyed more than anything else. Hours went by without my knowledge until I got up and he did the same, but nothing transpired. I felt that was worse. The next morning, I woke up feeling drained, like I hadn't slept at all. I reached for my phone automatically, barely thinking, until I saw the screen. My stomach dropped. I stared at the call, my pulse hammering. I couldn't answer. Not here, not now. The call ended. A few seconds later, another one came and I stood up, gripping my phone tightly, my mind racing. I needed to leave fast. I turned toward him, but he was by the window looking out over the city. I hesitated for half a second, but I didn't know what I was waiting for. I should go, I said. He didn't argue. He just watched. I grabbed my things and left without looking back. The hallway felt too bright, too open. I moved quickly, trying not to think, trying not to feel. By the time I stepped outside, the cold air hit me like a slap. I got into my car, gripping the wheel with both hands. Another call came through. I didn't answer. This couldn't last forever. A few days later, Mom found his phone. She saw everything. I heard the sharp, frantic footsteps echoing down the hallway before I even had a chance to react. My stomach clenched instinctively, an invisible force twisting inside me, warning me that something was terribly wrong. My room's door slammed shut so forcefully that the handle banged against the wall behind it. As she stood there, Mom's face turned pale and her chest moved in rapid, irregular breaths. Her grip on his phone was so tight that her knuckles turned white. She refrained from screaming or even uttering my name because she knew I would be shocked and devastated. Her voice was barely audible, but it sliced through the air like a blade. I lay paralyzed on my bed, trying to come up with a reason to explain or undo what had been done, but I couldn't even see the screen to understand the messages she had found. Pictures of the times we believed were concealed in the darkness of late hours and whispered talks proof of an occurrence that ought never to have taken place. As I tried to speak, nothing came out of my mouth. My mom stepped forward, pushed the phone toward me, and told me it wasn't real. I couldn't tell her that it wasn't, and then I caught a glimpse of him standing in the doorway. Silent. He hadn't hurried in, tried to stop her, or even looked at me. His face was unreadable. Mom shifted her attention back to me as she shook uncontrollably and turned to him, but he said nothing. Her breathing became labored, and then something happened. Her anger didn't go away, but it became darker and more disgusting. In a voice thick with betrayal, she whispered, "You did this." The words hit me harder than I had anticipated, and I buried my fingers in the sheets, pressing the nails into the fabric as if I could physically hold myself together. My voice cracked, so I swallowed hard and tried again. This time, it was a mistake. My mother let out a hollow, bitter laugh, and she made the same mistake twice. I witnessed her life crumble as she realized this wasn't an illusion, a cruel joke, or a misunderstanding. It was real, and I had broken her. She looked at him as if expecting him to deny it, fight back, or do something, but he didn't. His silence was the most deafening sound in the room. The phone slipped from her fingers, hitting the floor with a dull thud. She pressed a trembling hand to her forehead, as if trying to steady herself, as if the walls of the house she had built, the light she thought she knew, weren't crumbling around her. Her voice was barely audible when she spoke again. How long I hesitated, the answer didn't matter. It would hurt her no matter what I said. But she wasn't looking at me anymore. She was looking at him, and for the first time since this confrontation started, I saw something in his expression: guilt, regret, fear. Mom's lips parted, as if she wanted to ask something else, but no words came out. The silence between us stretched thick and suffocating. Then suddenly she let out a choked breath and turned away, as if the sight of me was too much to bear. Get out. It took me a second to process her words. What she lifted her head, eyes burning with something that made my chest tighten. I said. Her voice cracked, but she steadied herself, her hands curling into fists at her sides. Get out. I felt my heart slam against my ribs. Mom, please don't. She shook her head violently. Don't you dare try to explain this to me. With a quiver in her voice, she said, I can't look at you right now. The conviction in her words made me gasp for oxygen. I twisted around to face him, hoping against hope that he would say something, fix things, fight for us, or at least look down at the floor. Instead, he remained motionless and silent, looking like a coward. I swallowed hard, got my legs moving, and gathered everything I could find: my jacket, my bag, and anything else I could get my hands on. I brushed past him and out into the hallway, never looking back. As soon as I stepped outside, the chilly night air touched my skin, my breath came in irregular gasps, and the world felt too big, too loud, too real. I pulled my jacket closer around me. I reached for my phone, my grip shaking with fear. There was no one to contact, and the only person who had been through this with me had remained trapped in the debris we had wrought, too terrified to flee. I closed my eyes tightly, attempting to escape the sight of my mom's devastated face as her world crumbled around her. I was the one who had liked the match, and now I stood alone in the midst of the flames.